There was a boy in Paris in the 1840s who could not read very well, whose eyesight was poor, who sat at the back of the classroom and drew in the margins of his books while the other children recited their lessons. His father was a clerk at the prefecture of police, a man who worked with papers and stamps and the small machinery of municipal order. His mother was quiet, pious, from Lorraine. They lived in a modest apartment in a working district on the left bank, and the boy Auguste, their second son, was not remarkable in any way that the schools of the time were designed to notice. He was nearsighted, which meant that the world came to him not as a panorama, but as a series of close surfaces. He learned to see by touch before he learned to see by distance. When he was 10, his father enrolled him in a boarding school run by an uncle in Beauvais, north of Paris, and the boy was miserable. He could not keep up with the lessons. The letters swam on the page. But he could draw. He filled the edges of his notebooks with profiles, hands, the folds of a curtain, the way a coat hung on a chair. When he was 14, his father withdrew him from the school and let him enroll at the Petite École, the imperial school of drawing and mathematics on the Rue de l'École Bénédictine. It was 1854. The Petite École was not the École des Beaux-Arts, the grand academy where painters and sculptors were trained for the salon and for history. It was a place for decorators, for craftsmen, for boys who would go into the trades. But it had good teachers. It had a man named Horace Lecoq de Boisbourdon, who taught his students to draw from memory, to look at a model or an object until it was internalized, and then to reconstruct it on paper without reference. He believed that art was not about copying, but about understanding form so deeply that it became part of the body's knowledge. Rodin stayed at the Petite École for 3 years. He learned to draw. He learned to model in clay. He went to the Louvre and stood in front of ancient sculptures, Greek and Roman fragments, torsos without heads, heads without bodies. He went to the Bibliothèque Impériale and copied prints. He began to understand that sculpture was not decoration, not ornament, but a language with its own history and its own mysteries. When he was 17, he applied to the École des Beaux-Arts. He submitted his drawings and his models. He was rejected. He applied again the next year. Rejected. He applied a third time. Rejected again. The judges found his work crude, uncertain, lacking in the refinement and the classical polish that the Academy required. He had no facility for the idealized human form, no taste for the smoothness that was the mark of official sculpture. His surfaces were rough. His figures seemed unfinished, as though they had been pulled from the clay before they were ready. After the third rejection, he did not apply again. He was 20 years old, and his formal education was over. He went to work. For the next 18 years he earned his living as an ornamental craftsman, a maker of decorative stonework and commercial sculpture. He worked for other artists, for studios that produced caryatids and cornices and capitals for the new buildings going up all over Haussmann's Paris. He worked for a man named Albert Ernest Carrier-Belleuse, a successful sculptor who supplied mantels and medallions and architectural ornament to the bourgeoisie. Rodin's name did not appear on any of this work. He was a hand, a pair of hands, one laborer among many in the vast anonymous production of the Second Empire's built environment. He lived with his mother and father. He had no studio of his own, no patrons, no exhibitions. In the evenings, after work, he modeled small figures in clay. He read Dante and Baudelaire. He went to the Louvre and stood in front of the sculptures, learning them by heart. He fell in love with the surfaces of Michelangelo, the way the chisel left its mark, the way a figure could seem to be struggling out of the stone. He understood that finish was a kind of lie, that the process of making could be more truthful than the completed form. When he was 22, his sister Maria died. She had been planning to become a nun, and then she had fallen ill, and then she was gone. Rodin, stricken, entered the Order of the Fathers of the Very Holy Sacrament, a teaching congregation. He stayed for a few months. The Father Superior, a man named Pierre Julien Aimard, saw that Rodin was not called to religious life and told him, gently, that his vocation was art, not prayer. Rodin left the order and returned to his work as a craftsman. He met a young seamstress named Rose Barret. She was 19, from Champagne, working in Paris. She became his model and then his companion. They never married, but they stayed together, on and off, for the rest of their lives. In 1866, she gave birth to a son, Auguste Eugène Bourret. Rodin did not acknowledge the boy publicly for many years. The decade that followed was a long, slow accumulation. Rodin worked for Carrier Bolus. He saved money. He traveled to Italy for the first time in 1875, at the age of 35, and spent 2 months studying Michelangelo and Donatello. In Florence, he stood in the Medici chapel and looked at the figures of night and day, dawn and dusk, and understood that sculpture could carry time within it, that a body could express not just a pose, but a movement, a hesitation, a moment between one state and another. When he returned to Paris, he began work on a life-size male figure. He worked on it for 18 months, alone, in a stable he had rented as a studio. The figure was a young man, nude, standing with one arm raised, the weight shifted slightly to one leg. The surface was rough, unpolished, but the anatomy was exact. Every muscle, every tendon was articulated with a precision that came from years of looking, years of modeling decorative figures in the studios of other men. He called it the Age of Bronze. He exhibited it at the Salon in 1877. The critics accused him of having made a cast from a living model. They said the figure was too lifelike, too accurate to have been modeled by hand. It was a scandal and also a kind of breakthrough. The accusation was false, but it revealed something true. Rodin's naturalism was so complete that it exceeded the conventions of the Salon, which expected either classical idealization or romantic exaggeration. His figure was neither. It was a body, rendered with absolute fidelity, and it disturbed people. Rodin defended himself. He produced photographs of the model, a young Belgian soldier named Auguste Rodin. He invited critics and officials to his studio to see the original clay and the plaster casts. Gradually, the scandal subsided. The figure was purchased by the state. Rodin was 37 years old, and for the first time, his name appeared in the press, not as an assistant or a craftsman, but as an artist. 2 years later, in 1879, he received a commission from the state to create a decorative portal for a new museum of decorative arts that was being planned in Paris. The museum was never built, but the commission stood. Rodin was given a stipend and a studio. He was asked to design a monumental bronze door inspired by Lorenzo Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise in Florence, but reinterpreted for the modern age. The subject was to be drawn from Dante's Inferno. He called it the Gates of Hell. It became the single largest project of his life, and he never finished it. For 37 years, from 1880 until his death in 1917, he worked on the gates, revising, reconfiguring, pulling figures out and adding new ones, treating the whole structure not as a commission to be completed, but as a laboratory, a source, a reservoir of forms. From the gates came dozens of individual sculptures that would be cast and exhibited independently: the Thinker, the Kiss, the Three Shades, Ugolino and his sons, Paolo and Francesca, the Falling Man, the Crouching Woman, the Prodigal Son. The gates became not a door but a world, a vertical field of bodies in torment, desire, grief, and transformation. The original plan was simple: 2 large panels, each divided into sections, with a tympanum above and a sculptural group at the base. But as Rodin began to work, the structure mutated. The panels became dense with overlapping figures, hundreds of them, small and large, emerging from the bronze like souls emerging from the earth. There was no clear narrative, no orderly procession through the circles of hell. Instead, the door became a kind of visual poem, a field of associations and echoes. Figures appeared and reappeared in different positions. Some were in high relief, others barely visible, as though they were sinking back into the surface. Some were falling, some were climbing, some were frozen in postures of ecstasy or despair. At the center of the tympanum, Rodin placed a seated figure, a man bent forward, his chin resting on his fist, his body tense with thought. This was the thinker. Originally, the figure was meant to represent Dante himself, the poet contemplating the circles of hell laid out below him. But as Rodin worked on the figure, it became something more general, more archetypal, a man thinking not about one thing, but about everything, about the human condition, about fate and sin and mortality. The figure was muscular, physical, not a philosopher in robes, but a laborer, someone whose thought was not abstract but bodily, a kind of physical suffering. The gates were never installed. The museum they were intended for was cancelled. But Rodin kept working. He set up a large studio on the Rue de l'Université, and the gates occupied the center of the space, a constant presence, a structure he could walk around and into, adding figures, removing them, trying out variations. He treated the door not as a single work, but as a generative matrix, a source of forms that could be extracted, enlarged, recontextualized. In the early 1880s, he began to exhibit figures that had originated in the gates as independent sculptures. The Kiss, originally a small relief showing Paolo and Francesca from Dante's story, was enlarged to life-size and exhibited at the Salon in 1887. It became one of the most popular sculptures in Europe, reproduced in countless versions, a symbol of romantic love. But for Rodin, it was just one moment in a much larger cosmology, one instant of desire frozen in marble. He preferred the unfinished to the polished. He exhibited partial figures' torsos without heads or arms, legs without bodies, as complete works. He was among the first sculptors to do this. In a classical tradition, a fragment was a ruin, something incomplete due to damage or time, but for Rodin, the fragment was a choice, a way of focusing attention on the expressive power of a single part. A torso could carry as much meaning as a full figure, sometimes more, because it did not offer the distraction of a face or a gesture. It was pure form, pure surface, the play of light and shadow over bronze or marble. He worked in clay first, always. He built up the figure by hand, adding small pieces, smoothing and shaping, then cutting away, leaving marks, leaving the process visible. When the clay was ready, it was cast in plaster, and from the plaster, a bronze could be made or a marble could be carved by assistants under his supervision. He did not carve marble himself after the early years. He had teams of craftsmen who worked from his plasters, translating the rough surfaces of the clay into the smooth or semi-smooth surfaces of stone. He was obsessed with movement. Not movement as action, but movement as potential, as the instant before or after an action, the moment when a body is poised between two states. His figures were never static. Even when they were seated or reclining, there was a tension, a sense that they might shift or turn or rise. He achieved this through asymmetry, through the torsion of the body, through the way he modeled the muscles and the skin so that they seemed to be responding to an inner force. In 1883, the city of Calais commissioned him to create a monument to the burghers of Calais, the 6 citizens who, according to legend, had offered themselves as hostages to the English king Edward III during the siege of 1347 in order to save their city. The city wanted a monument in the traditional mode, heroic figures on a high pedestal, idealized and dignified, an inspiration to civic pride. Rodin proposed something else. He proposed 6 figures, life-size, standing at ground level without a pedestal. The figures were not heroic. They were exhausted, uncertain, marked by the weight of their decision. Some were hunched, some were gesturing, one was covering his face. They wore rough robes, not the drapery of classical sculpture, but the plain cloth of medieval burghers. Their feet were bare, their faces gaunt. They looked like men going to their deaths, which is what they were. The city rejected the design. The committee wanted something more uplifting, more in keeping with the conventions of public sculpture. Rodin refused to change it. The commission was delayed for years. Finally, in 1895, a bronze cast was installed in Calais, but not at ground level as Rodin had wanted. It was placed on a pedestal, lifted above the viewers, turned back into a monument. It was not until the 20th century that the sculpture was installed as Rodin had intended, at eye level, so that viewers could walk among the figures, could see them not as icons, but as men. The Burghers of Calais was one of the first modern public monuments, a work that questioned the entire tradition of commemorative sculpture. It refused heroism. It refused idealization. It insisted on the reality of suffering, the ambiguity of sacrifice, the humanity of historical figures who had been turned into symbols. It was not a popular work in its time, but it changed what a monument could be. By the mid-1880s, Rodin's reputation was beginning to grow beyond France. He exhibited in Brussels, in London, in New York. He was written about in journals and magazines. Collectors began to seek out his work. He was still poor, still working in cramped studios, but he was no longer invisible. In 1883, a young woman named Camille Claudel came to his studio. She was 18 years old, a sculptor, already highly skilled. She had been studying with a minor sculptor named Alfred Boucher, and when Boucher left Paris, he recommended that his students continue their work with Rodin. Camille was among them. She was intense, ambitious, fearless in her work. She modeled figures with a naturalism and a psychological depth that equaled Rodin's own. Within a few months, she was not just his student, but his assistant and then his collaborator. She worked on the gates of hell, modeling hands and feet and figures that Rodin would incorporate into the larger structure. She had her own projects, her own vision, but she was also drawn into his orbit, into the vast, consuming labor of the gates. She became his lover. He was 43, she was 19. Rose Barrett, who had been with him for nearly 20 years, was still his companion, still living with him, still modeling for him. But Rodin and Camille began a relationship that was both professional and personal, both collaborative and passionate. For the next 10 years they worked together. Camille had her own studio, her own commissions, but she was also deeply involved in Rodin's work. She modeled for him, he modeled for her. They discussed form and surface and the problems of representation. She pushed him toward a greater intimacy, a greater emotional directness. Some of the most tender and psychologically acute works of Rodin's career, The Eternal Idol, The Hand of God, The Kiss, in its later versions, were made during the years of their relationship, and some critics have argued that Camille's influence is visible in them, that her sensibility, her intensity, entered his work in ways that he never fully acknowledged. She made her own sculptures, Sakuntala, a tender embrace of two figures, the waltz, a couple spinning in each other's arms, the Age of Maturity, a monumental group showing a young woman reaching out to an older man who is being pulled away by an aged figure representing time or fate. The Age of Maturity was transparently autobiographical. The young woman was Camille. The older man was Rodin. The aged figure was Rose. Rodin would not leave Rose. He promised Camille that he would, that they would marry, that they would have a life together separate from his long entanglement with Rose. But he did not. He kept both women, kept both lives, and Camille, who had given up other opportunities, other relationships, in the hope that Rodin would commit to her, eventually realized that he would not. In 1893, she broke with him. She demanded that he choose. He did not. She left the studio, left the collaboration, and tried to build a career on her own. It was almost impossible. She had no access to the networks of patrons and state commissions that Rodin had cultivated over decades. She was a woman, and the art world of the 1890s was not interested in women sculptors, except as novelties or assistants. Her work was admired, but she received few commissions. She became isolated, suspicious, convinced, perhaps rightly, that Rodin was working against her, that he was blocking her access to patrons, that he was taking credit for works she had contributed to or influenced. She continued to sculpt, but her circumstances grew more difficult. She had no money. She destroyed much of her own work in fits of rage or despair. She believed that people were stealing from her, that Rodin was stealing from her, that her ideas were being taken and used without acknowledgement. In 1913, after the death of her father, her family had her committed to an asylum. She spent the last 30 years of her life in psychiatric institutions, first at Ville-Évrard, then at Montevergue in the south. She never sculpted again. She asked repeatedly to be released. Her requests were denied. Rodin, by then the most famous sculptor in the world, did not intervene. He may not have known the details of her institutionalization, or he may have chosen not to know. She died in 1943, during the German occupation of France. She was 78 years old. Most of her work had been destroyed. Rodin continued. After the break with Camille, he threw himself even more completely into his work. The gates of hell continued to evolve. He worked on the monument to Balzac, a commission from the Société Gens de Lettres that became one of the most controversial sculptures of his career. The commission was offered to him in 1891, 7 years after Balzac's death. The society wanted a statue of the writer for the streets of Paris, something dignified and recognizable, in the mode of traditional literary monuments. Rodin spent years researching Balzac's appearance, his clothing, his physique. He made dozens of studies, heads, bodies, figures in various poses. He traveled to Balzac's birthplace in tours, met people who had known him, studied photographs and descriptions. He tried a realistic approach first, modeling Balzac in contemporary dress, a frock coat and trousers. It did not work. The realism was too specific, too tied to a moment. He tried other versions, Balzac nude, Balzac in different postures. Nothing satisfied him. Then he had the idea of wrapping the figure in a long robe, a kind of monk's habit that Balzac had worn while working at night. The robe covered the body almost completely, leaving only the head and the hands visible. The figure stood upright, monumental, the robe falling in heavy vertical folds. The head was tilted back, the face rough and powerful, the expression one of visionary intensity. It was not a portrait of a man. It was a portrait of creative force, of the act of creation itself. The body was almost abstract, a massive column, the robe transforming the human figure into something elemental. The face was the only specificity, and even that was not realistic, but expressive, a mask of concentration and power. Rodin exhibited the plaster at the Salon in 1898. The reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Critics called it a monstrosity, a snowman, a sack of coal. The Société des Gens de Lettres rejected it and demanded their money back. The statue was removed from the salon and returned to Rodin's studio. He was devastated, but he also believed that the Balzac was the best thing he had ever made. He called it the sum of my whole life. He refused to compromise. The Balzac remained in his studio, uncast, for the rest of his life. It was not cast in bronze and installed publicly until 1939, 22 years after his death. The Balzac was the turning point in Rodin's career, the moment when he moved fully beyond the conventions of 19th-century sculpture into something that would influence the 20th-century modernism's emphasis on form over representation, on expression over likeness, on the sculpture as an autonomous object rather than a depiction of something else. By the turn of the century, Rodin was famous. He had a large studio at Moudon outside Paris, with assistants and secretaries, and a constant stream of visitors, collectors, writers, critics, artists, society figures. He was invited to exhibit internationally. In 1900, he had a major retrospective at the Place de l'Alma in Paris, a private pavilion built specially for the occasion, showing more than 150 works. The exhibition was a sensation. Rodin was hailed as the greatest living sculptor, the heir to Michelangelo. He was also by this time wealthy. He sold his work in multiple editions, bronzes cast from the same molds, marbles carved from the same models. The same figure might exist in several sizes, in several materials, sold to different collectors. This was a break from the 19th century idea of the unique artwork. Rodin treated his sculptures as reproducible forms, variations on a theme, and he was unapologetic about it. He was a difficult man to work with. He was demanding, obsessive, self-centered. He treated his assistants as extensions of his own will. He was surrounded by models, young women, often dancers or performers, who posed for him in his studio. He drew them constantly, thousands upon thousands of quick sketches, capturing movement, gesture, the way a body turned or stretched or folded in on itself. Many of these models also became his lovers. He had numerous affairs, some brief, some extended, and he seems to have felt little guilt about it. Rose remained in his life, a constant presence in the background, managing the household, but their relationship was more companionship than romance by this point. He continued to work on the Gates of Hell, but the project had become less a commission than a private obsession, a structure that could never be finished because it was the source of everything else. He pulled figures out, enlarged them, exhibited them as independent works. The thinker was cast in multiple sizes, from small tabletop versions to a monumental bronze over 6 feet tall. The kiss was reproduced in marble and bronze, sold to collectors around the world. The gates themselves remained in plaster in his studio, a ghostly white structure covered with figures, some fully modeled, others barely begun, all of them caught in the moment of becoming. In 1904, he met a young woman named Gwen John, a Welsh painter who had moved to Paris to study. She became his model and his lover. The affair lasted, intermittently, for several years. Gwen John was in love with him in a way that was total and consuming, and he was, as always, inconstant. She wrote him hundreds of letters, passionate and pleading, and he responded rarely and without much warmth. After the affair ended, she remained in Paris, living in poverty, painting small, intense portraits and interiors. She never stopped loving him, and the relationship seems to have broken something in her, just as the relationship with Camille had broken something in Camille. Rodin's capacity for emotional callousness, for using people and then moving on, was limitless. He did not seem to register the damage, or perhaps he registered it and did not care. His work was the center, the only thing that mattered. Everything else, relationships, obligations, other people's feelings, was secondary. In 1908, he moved into the Hotel Biron, an 18th-century mansion in Paris that was being rented out as studios to artists and writers. Rodin took over several rooms on the ground floor, and eventually the entire building. He filled it with his sculptures, his drawings, his collection of antiquities. The building, surrounded by overgrown gardens, became a kind of personal museum, a monument to his own work. It is now the Musée Rodin. He continued to exhibit, to sell, to model and cast and supervise the production of new works. But the later years were less about innovation than consolidation. He reworked old themes. He made new versions of figures from the gates, sometimes combining elements from different sculptures into new configurations. He treated his existing works like a repertoire, a set of forms that could be recombined and represented. In 1914, the First World War began. Rodin was 74 years old. The war disrupted everything: the art market, the international exhibitions, the flow of visitors and patrons. He continued to work, but his health was declining. He had a series of strokes. His memory was failing. He spent more time at Meudon in the house he shared with Rose, and less time at the Hotel Byron. In January of 1917, he married Rose Buret. They had been together for 53 years. She was ill, dying of pneumonia. They were married in a small civil ceremony at Meudon. She died 2 weeks later. Rodin was present, but by this time he was barely able to speak or recognize people. He died 9 months after her, in November of 1917, at Meudon. He was 77 years old. France was still at war. His death was noted in the press, but there was little room for extended mourning or commemoration. He was buried at Meudon, beneath a bronze cast of the thinker. The gates of hell were finally cast in bronze after his death, the first cast completed in 1926. There are now several casts in museums around the world: Paris, Philadelphia, Zurich, Tokyo. The gates stand as a monument to incompletion, a work that was never finished, and perhaps never could have been finished, because its purpose was not to arrive at a final form but to be a process, a continuous generation of forms. The thinker became one of the most reproduced images in the world. It appears in parks, in museums, in public squares on every continent. It has been copied, parodied, commercialized, turned into kitsch. But the original, the first cast, still carries its power: the hunched body, the massive hands, the face half hidden, the sense of a mind turned inward, struggling with something that cannot be solved. Rodin's legacy is immense and also complicated. He is the figure who stands between the 19th century and the 20th, between academic sculpture and modernism. He broke the conventions of his time: the polished surfaces, the idealized bodies, the clear narratives of public monuments, and created a language of sculpture that emphasized process, fragment, psychological intensity, and the expressive power of the unfinished. But his personal life, his treatment of the people around him, casts a shadow over that legacy. Camille Claudel's story, in particular, has become inseparable from his. She was not just his muse or his assistant, but his collaborator, his equal in skill and vision, and she was erased by him, by the art world, by her own family. Her institutionalization, her silence, her forgotten work, constitute one of the most painful injustices in art history. In recent decades, there has been a recovery of her work, an acknowledgement of her importance, but the fact remains that she spent half her life in an asylum while Rodin was celebrated around the world. It is possible to hold both truths at once: that Rodin transformed sculpture, that his work is profound and original and moving, and that he was also a man who caused great harm, who used people and discarded them, who lived entirely for his work and did not consider the cost to others. The work remains. The gates of hell, with their teeming multitudes, their endless variations on desire and suffering. The thinker, solitary and monumental. The burghers of Calais, standing at eye level, not heroes, but human beings, marked by doubt and fear and the weight of their own decision. The kiss, frozen in its moment of embrace, pulled from a larger context and turned into an icon. The fragments, the hands, the torsos, the partial figures that insist on the eloquence of the incomplete, and Camille Claudel's work, what remains of it, the age of maturity, with its 3 figures locked in a triangle of longing and loss. Sakuntala, tender and intimate, the waltz, bodies in motion. These works stand alongside Rodin's, not as footnotes but as independent achievements, evidence of a talent that was never fully allowed to develop, a career that was stopped, a life that was taken. Rodin's studio at Meudon is still there, filled with plasters and fragments and tools. The Hotel Byron in Paris is the Musée Rodin, its gardens dotted with bronze figures, its rooms filled with his sculptures and drawings and the objects he collected. Visitors walk through slowly, standing in front of the works, looking at the surfaces, the rough textures, the way the light moves over bronze and marble. There is something in the work that resists easy interpretation, that remains open, unresolved. The figures are not telling stories. They are not illustrating ideas. They are bodies, caught in moments of tension, movement, thought, feeling. They are surfaces that bear the marks of the hand that made them. They are fragments that suggest wholes without ever completing them. Rodin believed that the fragment was more truthful than the whole, that a torso or a hand could carry more meaning than a full figure because it did not pretend to completeness. He believed that the process of making, the marks of the chisel or the thumb in the clay, were part of the work's truth. He believed that sculpture was not about representing the body, but about expressing something that the body could carry: emotion, thought, time, the weight of existence. These beliefs were radical in the 1880s and 90s, when sculpture was still expected to be smooth, finished, narrative. They became foundational for the 20th century, for artists like Brancusi and Giacometti and Henry Moore, who took Rodin's emphasis on form and surface and pushed it further into abstraction, into minimalism, into new languages of three-dimensional form. But Rodin was not an abstract artist. He was rooted in the body, in the human figure, in the expressive potential of anatomy and gesture. He was the last of the great figural sculptors and the first of the modern ones. Standing at the hinge between two eras, looking backward to Michelangelo and forward to the 20th century. His influence is everywhere. In the way we accept partial figures as complete works, in the way we value the trace of the artist's hand, the visible process, the marks of making, in the way we understand public monuments not as idealizations but as expressions of complexity, doubt, humanity, and his shadow is everywhere too. In Camille Claudel's absence, her 30 years in institutions, her destroyed work. In the silence around the women who modeled for him, who loved him, who were used and discarded. In the question of what it means to separate the work from the life, to admire the sculptures while acknowledging the harm their maker caused. There is no easy resolution to this. The work is still there, still powerful, still capable of moving people who stand in front of it. And the history is still there, the record of cruelty and indifference, the lives damaged and discarded in service of the work. Rodin worked on the Gates of Hell for 37 years, and he never finished them. They were a project without end, a doorway that led nowhere, a structure that existed only to generate other works. Perhaps that is the image to hold on to the endless door, the work that is always in progress, the form that is never complete. Because Rodin's legacy is not a single thing. It is a field of contradictions, of brilliance and harm, of innovation and selfishness, of work that changed the language of sculpture and lives that were broken in its making. The sculptures are in museums now, behind glass or roped off, carefully lit and labeled. But something in them still resists containment. The surfaces are too rough, too marked by the hand. The figures are too tense, too caught in moments of transition. The fragments are too eloquent, too insistent on what is missing. You can stand in front of the thinker in the garden of the Musée Rodin on a quiet afternoon in autumn, the leaves falling, the light slanting through the trees, and the figure is still there, bent forward, thinking. The weight of the world in the hunch of the shoulders, the press of the fist against the face. It is one of the most familiar images in art, reproduced so many times that it has become a symbol, almost an abstraction. But in person, in bronze, the figure is still a body, specific and massive, the muscles articulated, the surface rough, the posture impossible to sustain for more than a moment, but somehow frozen, held, turned into something permanent. Rodin once said that the artist's job was not to copy nature, but to intensify it, to take what is seen and push it towards something more essential, more expressive. He said that a sculpture should not explain itself, that it should carry a mystery, something that cannot be put into words. He succeeded in that. The works do not explain themselves. They are not illustrations or arguments. They are presences, dense and physical, marked by the labor of their making, carrying within them the weight of the bodies they depict and the weight of the hands that made them. And they are also markers of absence, the absence of the figures that were never finished, the versions that were destroyed, the works that exist only in sketches or descriptions, the absence of Camille Claudel's voice, her work, her life after 1913, the absence of the men and women who modeled and posed and labored in the studios and whose names are mostly lost. Art history tends to simplify. It wants heroes and masterpieces, clear lines of influence, stories with beginnings and endings. But the real history is messier, more tangled, full of overlapping lives and stolen credit, and works that emerge from collaborations that are never fully acknowledged. Rodin's work did not come from nowhere. It came from years of labor as a craftsman, from the studios of other artists, from the models who posed for hours, from the assistants who carved the marbles and cast the bronzes, from Camille Claudel's hands and mind and vision, from the whole network of people and skills and ideas that made the work possible. And yet the work is also his. He was the one who saw the possibility of the fragment, who pushed the surfaces toward roughness, who treated the gates of hell as a lifelong project, who refused to smooth and finish and idealize. He was the one who had the vision and the stubbornness to insist on it, even when it was rejected, even when it was mocked. It is possible to acknowledge both things, that the work was his and that it was not only his, that he was a great artist and that he was a destructive man, that the sculptures are beautiful and that they were made at great cost to others. In the end, the work outlasts the life. That is both the triumph and the tragedy of art. The life ends, the relationships dissolve, the people involved are forgotten or erased, and the work remains, silent, open to interpretation, carrying within it all the contradictions and complexities that the artist could not resolve. The gates of hell stand in the garden at Meudon, the figures writhing and falling and climbing, Dante's vision translated into bronze, transformed into something personal and obsessive, a doorway that was never installed, a portal to nowhere. Above them, the thinker sits alone, bent forward, lost in thought, a figure who has become so familiar that it is hard to see him clearly, hard to remember that he was once just a detail in a larger work, one figure among hundreds, pulled out and enlarged and turned into an icon. But if you look long enough, past the familiarity, past the reproductions, the figure is still there, a body in bronze, the surface rough and marked, the posture tense, the mind turned inward. He is thinking, and what he thinks is not revealed. The sculpture does not explain, it only shows a man, alone, burdened, concentrated, caught in a moment that has no end. And around him, in museums and gardens and public squares across the world, the other figures stand and sit and embrace and fall, each one a moment pulled from the flow of time and held, each one a body rendered in bronze or marble or plaster, each one marked by the hands that made it, and by the vision that saw it first as clay and then as form. Rodin is gone, Rose is gone, Camille is gone. The assistants, the models, the critics, the patrons, all gone. But the work is still here, still present, still capable of stopping people in their tracks, of making them pause and look and wonder. That is what remains, not the life, not the scandals, not the fame or the sorrow, but the work. The surfaces, the fragments, the bodies caught in motion, the faces turned inward, the hands reaching out, the figures emerging from bronze as though they were emerging from the earth itself, pulled into form by force and vision and the long, slow labor of making. And in the silence of museums, in the gardens where the sculptures stand among the trees, the work continues its quiet insistence that the body can be a language, that the fragment can be more eloquent than the whole, that the unfinished can carry more truth than the complete, that art is not about perfection, but about presence, about the marks of the hand, the struggle of the form, the mystery that cannot be explained but only shown. Rodin made that language. He did not invent it. No artist invents anything entirely, but he transformed it, pushed it beyond the conventions of his time, opened a door that others would walk through. And in doing so, he left behind not just a body of work, but a way of seeing, a way of understanding what sculpture could be, what it could do, what it could express. That is the legacy. Not simple, not pure, not without shadow or cost, but real and still here, waiting in the galleries and the gardens, in bronze and marble and plaster, in the rough surfaces and the partial forms, in the figures that seem to be moving even as they stand still, in the faces that do not explain themselves, in the hands that reach and hold and grasp at something just beyond reach. The work is here, and it is enough.